This is my book, A Women's Game, and I think it's particularly pertinent to be talking about women's football so soon after the Euros, which I'm sure many of you could not avoid in the summer, which is a little bit of a shift change for the women's game. It's not used to necessarily having as many eyes and ears on it as it did during the summer's tournament. This is the original cover of my book on the left and the new cover of my book on the right, which is yet to be released following the success of the Euros. And it's, I suppose, the choice of image speaks to the sort of revolution that has happened in women's football in England in recent years. The image on the left is of Brandy Chastain celebrating the US women's team winning the World Cup in 1999, which was really a game-changing tournament for women's football in the United States. And then Chloe Kelly similarly replicating that celebration inadvertently, unconsciously, as England won the Euros, was pretty symbolic of the kind of shift change we're seeing in England at the moment. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of a sort of brief history of women's football in a nutshell, to give you a little bit of a flavour of what's in the book. So the very first examples of women's football, I think a lot of people know, if they know about football generally, will be aware that the very, very first forms of people kicking balls was in China in sort of around the sort of Han Dynasty. But what many people don't know is actually women playing football was also prevalent at that time. There's a game called Cujo, called kickball, and some of these images that you can see there suggest that women also played the sport. There's very, very few bits of evidence to kind of really be able to say definitively that it was a sport that was played, kind of on teams in the same way that there is archival evidence that the men's game was and stuff, but there is enough evidence to suggest that women were also involved in playing sport as early as that, which is quite exciting because obviously women's football is very much treated as a bit of a new phenomenon. So the late 1800s was the first example of women's football kind of getting a little bit of a foothold in England. There was initially, before some of these pictures, there was the first attempt of the first recorded football match between two women's teams was a game in Scotland in 1888 between an England team and a Scotland team that was made up of women theatre players by a theatre entrepreneur who saw the growth of men's international football and thought this could be a unique way of jumping on that bandwagon. Shortly after that, in 1884, a woman called Nettie Honeyball, which was a pseudonym, she's the woman on the top left, who was a bit of an aristocrat, launched the British Ladies Football Club, put an advert in the newspaper calling for players to come and join the team, and essentially founded a British women's football team that would compete against a team in Scotland, which was run by a woman called Mrs. Graham, another pseudonym. At that time, it was very much a political move. Nettie Honeyball and the team's patron, Lady Dixie, were like staunch feminists, had campaigned for gender neutral clothing and things like that, and they saw football as a tool to progress sort of suffrage and feminist ideas at the time. So they saw this hugely popular sport and thought, this is a way to reach the masses and bring people towards those ideas on a much greater scale, to challenge some of the ideas of what women should be and do at the time, and push back against them. So that was the very, very first examples. They play games up and down the country. They got some pretty horrific press, games physically attacked, police having to sort of break up crowds on horseback, that kind of thing. This was some of the examples of sort of the coverage of women playing at that time. This was in the Sketch magazine, real sort of mocking take of women playing football. So you've got top right, the poor referee, this like sort of crowd of women swarming this poor referee in their lovely shirts. You've got a woman arriving at the match in her full full gear, cane in hand, handbag at the ready. The women reading the newspapers afterwards, a very glamorous referee standing in goal, them kind of fanning themselves and doing their hair at half time and stuff, and very, very like sort of piss-takey, mocking of the idea of women being involved in football at the time. And that very much corresponded to what was taking place in society in general at that time. Women in the Victorian era were supposed to be delicate and elegant and pale, and not kind of be out in the sun fighting players on a pitch, but it's kind of sitting at a piano and reading a book and that kind of thing. So it was very much a kind of correlation between the attitudes towards women and the attitudes towards women playing sport. But in the sort of from about 1917 to the sort of mid 1920s, that shifted quite dramatically. The First World War had a huge impact on the growth of women's football, because with men going off to fight in the war, the factories were filled with women workers to fill the gap left behind by them. And very much in the same way that a lot of men's football teams were born out of the factories, so were a lot of women's teams. So it was less frowned upon for women to play football, because it was seen as like advantageous to have a fit and healthy workforce, to give them something to do, to keep them occupied and morale up and things like that. Football was suddenly a good thing for women to do at the time. So you had all these factory teams sort of spring up all across the country and really change the way people looked at women playing football. This is the most famous team of the time, Dick Kerr Ladies, who in 1953 in 1920 attracted 53,000 fans to Goodison Park for a game against local rival St Helens, which was the record crowd for a women's domestic club match for almost 100 years, right up until very, very recently. And they travelled the world. They played in France. They played in the US. They played against men's teams, and they drew crowds and raised money for charity like no tomorrow. They were so successful. Skipping that. They were so successful that the FA banned women's football in 1921, a year after the Dick Kerr Ladies had 53,000 at Goodison Park, citing it as being unsuitable for women to play football. Obviously, the war had ended in 1921. Women had gone back into the homes. They, needed to free up the jobs for men, and essentially push women back into the households, really. And so that meant that there was a big shift in the way that society saw women and the role of women, and that impacted the kind of effect that impacted women's football almost irrevocably. The FA banned women's football. It was a ban that lasted 50 years, and it wasn't an out-and-out ban. They couldn't literally stop women from playing football, but they ruled that women's teams weren't allowed to play on FA affiliated grounds anymore. So Goodison Park and all of the big men's stadiums were suddenly ruled out of action entirely, and that forced women's teams and players into parks, into athletics tracks, into rugby stadiums, anywhere that would let them play. But they were kind of grounds with significantly smaller capacities, and there was a huge sort of stepping down of crowd sizes as a result. They couldn't physically fit them there. So gradually the women's game shrunk in profile. There were teams that sort of battled on. Dick Kerr Ladies battled on until 1965. Manchester Corinthians was a team established during the ban that played all around the world. You can see their impressive trophy cabinet. They competed in tournaments in Italy, in France, really kind of well established, one of the teams of sort of the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s that led the way in pioneering the game at a time where they weren't allowed to play. In 1970, there was an unofficial World Cup, which attracted more than 40,000 to the final. There were talks of it possibly reaching even up to 90,000, and you can see the crowds there pretty huge. The first official World Cup didn't come around until 1991, which was not even called the World Cup because FIFA didn't want to bring down the brand. It was called the first FIFA World Championship for Women's Football for the M&M's Cup, and it was won by the US Women's National Team, and they returned it very low profile. They returned to America, zero fanfare, no one waiting for them at the airport, no one knew that they had won it. One player even said on the plane, the woman next to her asked her what she'd been doing, and had no idea that there had been a Women's World Cup, that they had won anything. You fast forward 8 years and you've got the 99ers in the US who won the World Cup again, but on US soil in front of a crowd of more than 90,000 fans in Pasadena, which is where the iconic picture from my book comes from. Brandi Chastain celebrating the winning penalty against China to win that tournament. Now, it massively transformed the game in the US. It exploded it onto the center stage. Girls were playing everywhere. There was unique set of circumstances around the US that meant that Title IX, a legislation which ruled that education institutions had to fund women and men's sports equally at college level and school level, meant that you had huge investment into women's soccer and women's sports programs in the same way that they did into sort of American football and baseball and things like that, and a very unique set of circumstances in that it was also not a big men's sport in the US too. But now we're seeing here a sort of similar resurgence of women's football on the scale of the 99ers as a result of the Euros. The England women's national team winning the Euros has changed the game forever. I burst into tears at the final because I followed the women's football since I was quite young, and had covered many of those players for a number of years, and really watched how hard they had fought to get to that position. So many of them started as amateurs, working a number of jobs. I remember Jill Scott talking about training in a prison gym up in the northeast, because they had the best gym facilities at the time in the sort of early 90s. And that was sort of the level that they had started at. So to see them reach this sort of pinnacle of the game in 2022 was particularly special. But that wasn't a victory that was a surprise in many respects, because it had very much been built for. The FA had in 2017 launched a strategy for the women's game that included targeting success at the Euros in 2021, which became 2022 as the pandemic pushed the tournament back, and at the World Cup this year in Australia and New Zealand. And they've already met one of those targets by winning the Euros. So it was very much a plan, a structured approach to build and put the support structure around the team and the facilities and the resources into the team that would enable them to reach success. And that's in many ways why the Euros win is about so much more than a team winning a football tournament, because that team showed that if you invest in women and support them and back them properly, they can achieve great things. And that sends a much wider message to women and girls in many, many other areas about the importance of feeling valued and of being supported, but also to businesses generally, to sports generally, that if you invest in women, it pays off. It's not money thrown into the dark, and it's empowered a lot of those players to speak out very strongly on issues that matter to them, like the right of girls to be able to play football and benefit from a lot of the 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 life skills that it's given them. I remember one player very recently saying to me, um, I want a girl to be able to choose not to play football because that means they had the choice in the first place. And I think that really speaks to the legacy of this team and what they were able to achieve. And that's a real sort of like game changing moment that is going to enable a huge number of girls to be able to look at sport and feel like they belong in it and have a place, and can be strong and powerful and physical and athletic in a way that that bucks the trend and the way society says they should be. Thanks very much.